Hello, my name is Mike Schroer, and I'm here at the Yankee Air Museum on December 29th, 2018, a Saturday. And joining me is Gary Delisle, who is a videographer and who will be managing the video that we're creating this afternoon. The guest of the Yankee Air Museum is John Whitmore. Good to see you, John.
Thank you.
And we're doing this video for the purpose of enhancing the video library of the Yankee Air Museum here in Belleville, Michigan. And we're also going to send a copy of this to the Library of Congress and to John himself. John, you graduated college in 1962, is that correct?
That's correct.
You and I are pretty much part of the same generation.
Oh, yes.
And I recall summer jobs when I was in college, and they were jobs like waiting table, working as a lifeguard, maybe working for the county road commissioner if your father
Yes.
or mother knew somebody.
Mm-hmm.
You chose something quite a bit more adventurous than that.
Yes.
Tell us about the summer of 1959.
Well, in 1959, I was living in Maryland at the time. My father was in the government. And I applied and got a position out with the National Park Service in Yosemite National Park. And I was doing blister rust control, which is basically going up and down mountains looking for gooseberry bushes and ripping them out. In the meantime, this wasn't in Yosemite Valley, it was north of the valley, north of El Capitan, the big rock. And in the meantime, they also brought us in to do some fireworks. So that was the beginning of my experience with fighting fires. We did a little bit up in the high Sierras, and then we went to one big fire down in the down in a national park a bit south of there.
John, were you called a ground pounder? Is that what the guys were called?
At the time, yes. We didn't call ourselves that. That's a Smokejumper term for the people who do the real fighting.
I see. Okay. Now, later on, we're going to find out that you became a Smokejumper.
Yes.
But right now, you're pretty much earthbound.
Yes.
If you were to fight a fire, how would you get to the fire if you were a ground pounder?
Well, the back of a truck to the nearest point in the road to a trail, and then you'd walk in. Actually, in the high Sierras, I remember, I guess I got my first helicopter ride in and out of there. So it depended on the situation.
Would teams go in together? Would you always have a
Yes.
partner?
Oh yeah. Well, it would be more than one. I mean, more than two. It'd be the team. I don't know. Can't remember. 4, 5, 6 guys going in.
And when you were called to duty for a fire, what kind of equipment and clothing would you have?
Well, just our basic clothing, our basic mountain boots that we wore working in the mountains, and our jeans and our shirts, and they would supply. I can't remember hard hats at all at the time, perhaps, and they would supply the axes, the shovels, Pulaskis, things like that.
The Pulaski. Tell me more about the Pulaski.
It's, to my mind, it's the basic firefighting tool. It's for chopping fire line. It's sort of a sharp-edged hoe on one side and a fork on the other, and you use the hoe edge of it to chop the line, and the hoe part of it to rip out any roots in the line.
Okay. We've got a Pulaski here, or at least part of a Pulaski. We've got the business end.
Yes.
Let's take a moment and grab that, okay?
Yes. Okay, this, to my mind, is the basic tool for firefighting, for cutting a fire line. On this end, you sort of have a sharp hoe-like aspect to chop away at the duff, the biological material on top of the mineral earth, to clear it down to the mineral earth where it won't burn. This other end would be for ripping out roots that would go under what you have chopped, to make sure that fire didn't grow along those roots and across the fire line.
Typically, how wide would a fire line be?
Oh, 1.5 to 2 feet, I'd say.
Okay.
Not that wide. The basic term used is mineral earth. You get rid of the duff, that is all the biological material that sets on a forest floor. You cut all of that aside and get down to the mineral earth, because by definition the mineral earth will not burn or carry fire. But anything that might burn, like these roots or the duff, leaves and stuff, pine needles, you want to get out of the way, because you want to have a line in which fire will not cross.
The '59 season began sometime in the late spring. Would that be typical?
Yes. But I was way up in the mountains in a very lonely ranger station, so I wasn't aware of whatever else was going on that summer.
Probably pretty cold up there too, wasn't it?
No.
Not really.
No. I mean, this is in the northern Rockies, in the Clearwater Forest, up west of Montana.
The fire season in the Clearwater Forest would extend from about June to when?
Well, till late August, September. The main thing there is the September rains would come in. Very foggy, chilly, damp weather would come in, and that would put a stop to any fire activity.
It also conveniently connected with when you had to go back to school, is that right?
Well, of course, but of course school in those days tended to start about the third week of September, so I had no problem with that.
Okay. You grew up in Silver Spring and graduated from high school there, right?
Actually not. I grew up in Hyattsville and moved to Silver Spring when I was 16, so I only lived in Silver Spring for 2 years.
Okay, but that's where you graduated from high school.
Montgomery Blair.
And Hyattsville is in Maryland as well, but
yes.
A little ways away.
That's over in Prince George's. We were in Montgomery.
How did you learn of this availability of a summer job?
I'm not sure. My father worked in the Interior Department. He was in the U.S. Geological Survey. So somehow or other I got the idea, but I really don't remember. I just wanted to go someplace different, I suppose.
I'm going to remind you of some words that were contained in the application that you filed many years ago. And so if you'll just bear with me a moment, I'm going to quote directly from the application.
Okay.
Duties of a smoke jumper are extremely hazardous, requiring arduous physical exertion. You must make parachute jumps into forested and mountainous terrain to suppress fires before ground crews can reach the fire area.
Yes.
Do you recall reading that?
I must have, but that probably, the first time I heard of jumpers was when I was down in California in '59, and we heard about these great guys up north or something like that. And it makes for great press, certainly.
So in '59, when you were working on the ground, the idea of flying and parachuting in seemed pretty interesting.
Pretty remote, yes.
Remote and maybe romantic too, when you
quite,
think about it.
Quite.
Let's look at 1960. In 1960, your second summer, you spent time as a station fireman, as I recall.
Yes, at a ranger station in the Canyon District of the Clearwater Forest.
And how did that differ from what you had done the prior year?
Well, the prior year every day we went out and up and down the mountainsides looking for those gooseberries. I was much more in camp, in charge of the fire equipment, such as it was in a single ranger station, and otherwise just working around doing whatever chores needed to be done around the station. But it allowed me to go off and hike in the mountains quite a bit.
You and I have talked a little bit about the planes that were part of your life those 4 summers. As a ground pounder in '59 and '60, you probably saw some use of fire retardant being dropped from planes. Was that something that you got involved in any way, shape, or form?
No, not really. They were, I'm not sure if I saw them in those years compared to the later years. They were just part of the whole thing. and we were given instructions of how to act when they went over, which is lie flat so you don't get knocked over by a blob of the stuff. And we knew that it was supposed to dampen down a fire, and once the fire is dampened down, then it was our opportunity to go in and cut the line and get it under control.
When it came time to stamping out a fire or dampening out a fire, you had a simple test to make sure that the fire was out, isn't that right?
Oh yes, yes. I mean, if you couldn't stick your hand in there, it wasn't out. Basically, it's the same thing as with a campfire. You want to go in, you want to chop it up. If you have water around, fine, put it on there. But basically, get rid of the hot spots. Make sure they don't flare up again.
The planes that were used by the Forest Service at that time were World War II surplus planes, weren't they?
That's my belief, yes.
And can you recall some of those planes that were in the service at that time?
Yeah, I never flew in them, of course, but the ones, we were at an air base in Missoula, Montana. I was in Region 1, and that's where they kept the planes who dropped the fire retardant in the water, and I seem to remember them being old bombers. I don't know, 17, 24, 25s, what have you, and also Navy dive bombers. And what struck me was that the Navy dive bombers were bigger and heavier than the B-24s, B-25s. It seemed to me that once those propellers went out on a Navy dive bomber, it didn't float at all.
And so these were all prop planes, weren't they?
Oh yes, of course.
The Yankee Air Museum has been working on a display honoring Smokejumpers, and you've been part of that crew that's worked on the display, is that right?
Well, I and a guy named Jim, the two former Smokejumpers we can find in Michigan, were brought in to help set up the mannequin, yes, to get all the equipment on in the right order.
And so the mannequin showing the equipment and how you guys were outfitted is part of a display that will include a Lockheed P-2V Neptune.
Okay, I don't know, that's the plane?
That's the one that the Yankee Air Force Museum just purchased.
Okay, right.
The Neptune.
The fire retardant dropper,
right.
Yes. And presumably that kind of plane was used after I was there, so I have no sense of it.
Now, in the summer of '61, you began Smokejumper training in Missoula, Montana.
Yes.
And you and the other trainees were called new men, is that right?
Something like that.
Yeah. Generally describe the training. Was it 7 days a week? Did you have any off time?
Well, we were regular government employees, so it was a 9-to-5 job. We were off on the weekends and everything. Our basic was both a physical training and learning how to parachute. Some guys in there I know were already skydivers, but we had to start with the basics since most of us had never jumped before. How to get out of the plane and how to land. Very specific ways of landing and everything, which I still remember. And then once the weekends came along, we were off duty. Although I do remember one time they came in looking for volunteers for a crew to go out hunting for the bones of a hunter who had disappeared the previous fall because they needed it for insurance purposes. So I do remember that. But otherwise, yeah, we were basically just 9 to 5 at that point.
And when you were trained, what kind of equipment and clothing would they train you with?
Well, we were trained in the original heavy canvas jumpsuits. Although at the time in the early 60s, they were making the transition from the regular jumps from the heavy canvas to the nylon. But we did train in the heavy canvas ones initially.
And you had something called a PG bag, is that right?
Yeah, the personal bag, just a beat up old knapsack that we were given at the time and kept our own personal gear in, that we would attach, when we jumped, we would attach to the harness sort of between our legs, and then once we hiked out, we would carry our personal gear bag with us after we dropped off all the regular equipment.
We've got your old PG bag here. Let's take a moment and show that.
It's quite different from what they have today. Ours is just the very simple canvas bag with a snap, one large pocket, nothing fancy. If you look at the one on the mannequin we have out there today, it is much fancier. Very, very, very nice bag. But this was just the basics.
Now, when you parachuted into an area, you had equipment with you to help you create that fire line, didn't you?
It was dropped to us, yes.
So you didn't carry that with you
No.
under the parachute?
No. All we had in our jumpsuits was a large pocket down on the right leg in which we carried 50 feet of what we called rope, sort of a nylon rope that we would use to get out of a tree if we happened to get stuck in a tree. And we had our personal gear bag plus our own stuff like a knife. And that's all we would have when we made the jump itself. And then they would drop the equipment to us on another parachute, and you had to make sure you didn't get hit by the equipment when it came down.
Were you ever caught in a tall tree?
It wasn't so much a matter of being caught, it was a matter of choice. If you looked down and you could see too many logs lying around on the ground and you went in there, you figure you're going to break your leg, then you aim for the top of a tree and purposefully hang your chute on the tree so that you don't have to worry about hitting the ground. And I did it once. Then you, using that rope, you climb out of the tree, and afterward you come back. We're taught how to climb a tree, as polemen do, to get the chute out.
So that sounds pretty complicated. You were rappelling. Is that one of the terms, a military term that they use?
Not rappelling. Rappelling is where you're sort of bouncing off a wall going down. No, you'd take the rope, you would tie it to the harness, get out of the harness, put the rope around under your right thigh, and then just lower yourself down. The rope would be attached to the harness. The harness, if you did a good job, would hung up solidly in the tree, and then you would just work your way down to the ground.
I imagine that tree that you hit by choice was an evergreen tree, is that right?
Well, all sorts of pine trees and stuff. What we were told to avoid were snags, that is dead trees, which might come over on top of you, or tamaracks, poplar trees, which I gather were fragile and would snap if you went into them. But no, if you went into any other kind of tree, it was okay.
What kind of planes were used to take jumpers up?
Yeah, it depended on how many jumpers were used. We would always go out as a team of two, one rookie, one of us new men, plus a veteran. And then we could go, they have as many as 8 or 16, depending on the size of the fire. Basically, we could go out in twin-engine Beechcraft, a twin beach, the kind where you had to sit in the door and go out, or more usually a C-47, DC-3. We also had DC-2s, an older version of the DC-3, C-46s. There are some wonderful planes that I never did get a chance to jump out of, the Ford Traveler, the Ford Trimotor, which were great because they could slow down in the air so much. But basically the DC-3.
How fast was the plane typically going when you jumped?
I'm not sure. The slow ones I've heard would go only about 45, so I don't know, 80 or 90, I suppose.
So the Ford Trimotor would have been the slowest in the
Yes,
back, right?
Exactly.
And once you jump at 1,000 feet or so.
Yeah, we would jump at 1,000 feet because we wanted to be high enough for the chute to open, but low enough so that we could have a good chance of hitting the landing spot.
And about how long were you in the air?
I'm not sure, a minute, couple minutes.
Yeah, right.
One didn't think about that. One was going to hit the ground eventually. So.
What you were thinking about
Yeah.
was your landing spot,
Yeah.
right?
First, when you go out the door, you got to look up and check your chute to make sure that it hadn't fouled up. You're carrying a reserve chute, and I still remember the procedure for using the reserve chute, although I never had to. Once you checked your chute, and then you're focused on the ground to where you want to go. We were able to steer our chutes, unlike paratroopers, and such that we could maneuver to get into the jump spot itself.
And when it came to the chutes, the chutes opened automatically. They were
Yes.
attached to a wire in the plane?
It's called a static line. There's a wire running along the top of the plane. Before we jumped, we would attach to that wire, and then so when we went out, the chute was immediately pulled and would automatically open. So the only choice we might have was if we had to use a reserve chute, but which I never had to use. So.
When you get ready to jump, there may be a couple of you in line. Is that right?
Yes. Yeah, in the DC-3s where you're standing up, you would have a line of, well, we would never jump more than 3 in a stick. Then we'd go around and jump the next 3. But if on the Twin Beach, where you would go out one at a time because you were sitting in the door, you weren't standing in it.
Who was in charge of making sure you were lined up properly and that everything was ready to go?
Every plane would have the pilot, obviously, a veteran pilot. They were very good for flying in the mountains. And then they would have a spotter, a veteran jumper, would coordinate with the pilot in terms of where the jump spot would be. We would fly around once or so. He would drop a streamer to test the wind to get a sense of what point we wanted to jump to go down to the landing spot. And then he would, as I say, coordinate with the pilot until the point where we would jump, and you'd be in the door and he would slap your leg or your back to tell you to get out.
Can you recall your first jump?
Not so much. The difficulty for me was the second jump, because the first jump you have certain preconceptions about what it might be, but the second jump you know what you've done wrong. You got to figure out how to do it right. So the first jump, it's just sort of in your head. The second jump, you got to get back to reality.
A typical fire that you would jump to would be a smaller fire. I think you've described that.
Yes. Yeah, there'd be a stream of smoke that presumably would be observed from a fire tower. You know, many fire towers scattered throughout the West. They would give the coordinates. They would call it in. The fire station would get it on the map, and then we would go out and looking for that stream of smoke and jump in the near, not into the fire, of course, but into a spot relatively nearby, and then hike up to the fire and take care of it.
And one way to take care of a fire, depending upon the geography and how large the fire was, was to stamp it out, right, with your feet.
Well, not quite. But yeah, chop it up, do a fire line around it, make sure all the hot spots were gone or were not dangerous. If there was fire in a tree, we might have to cut the tree down to make sure that the fire didn't, and put the fire out there. But yeah, there were usually just small little things.
By the way, when you graduated from that training, a rather well-known person gave you your degree or your certificate, a man named Earl Cooley.
Yes, Earl was famous, and he was one of the first 2 jumpers back, I believe, in 41. He was, forgotten his exact position, but he was in charge of the jumping when I started in 61. As I recall, he retired that summer. He lived till 98. There was a obituary of him in the Washington Post, as I recall. So yeah, he retired in July of 61, as I recall, and he was not a large guy. So we were jumping 28-foot chutes at the time, and the guy came in and took his place, and he recommended we use 32-foot chutes. Well, I used a 32-foot chute once and had a little trouble coming down. It just sort of, in the heat of the summer, it just sort of stopped, and I was sitting there in the chute figuring out what I was going to do. I did get down, but I never used a 32-foot chute again.
A little bit too much, huh?
Yes, I wasn't big enough.
Now, there was another story from 1961, a frightening story, when you were jumping from a Beechcraft. Tell us about that.
This was right at the end of August. turns out to be almost before I left. We went out on a twin beach over, I think, the Bob Marshall Wilderness area, somewhere to the east, northeast of Missoula. Standard stuff. And as I said, it was a twin beach, so the way you jumped out was you sat on the door and then when the spotter hit you on the back, pushed your way out. One time when I was jumping out of a twin beach, I was a little slow and got a little help from the spotter to get out the door. Anyway, back on this one, the first guy went out. He was sitting in the door. He was a veteran. And he went out, and all of a sudden we realized that he was hanging upside down underneath the plane. His strap had caught in the little sort of door frame, little foot frame under the door. And so before we realized what was happening, we were flying a little too low to cut him loose. The pilot feathered that left engine to make sure that the guy's chute didn't open and bring the plane down. We couldn't cut him loose at that point because we were far too low and the chute might not have had time to open. But fortunately, the ground dropped away from us faster than the plane was declining, so we reached a point where over a meadow where we were high enough and could cut him loose, and did. He floated down. He was okay. I went back and got ready for the next jump.
Yes, but first, you asked if you couldn't jump to make sure he was okay.
Yes.
And that would have been kind of a free jump for you, right?
Exactly. It would have been a lovely little jump to go out there and pat him on the back and hike out with him, and they said no, the guy's okay.
He waved.
And he waved back. He stood up a little unsteadily, I think, and waved, and we headed back to base.
And then the next summer was the summer of '62,
Mm-hmm.
and you were stationed where in '62?
Well, there were two crews went out of Missoula early. One went down to Arizona, and the other went up to Alaska. I was on the Alaska crew, so I went out to Missoula early, and in May, I guess, trained, and then we flew up to Alaska, up to Fairbanks, Nenana, outside Fairbanks, and the jumper base there.
I think that when you and I talked about these 4 years, you said something about some years being hot years,
yes,
and some years being cool years.
To us, we weren't paid that much. We were paid $1.95 an hour, and we did not get time and a half for overtime. And so the way we made money was by working the number of hours as much as possible. So the ideal for us was to get a fire call at 5 o'clock after having been paid for a full day, and going out and working overnight and adding those hours on. So we very much liked to go out and pile up the hours. And I was paid at one time in the end of that hot summer. I'm getting off the course a little.
No.
I worked for I was paid for 55 straight hours. I think I may have had 2 4-hour naps in the ashes or something. But that was the way we made our money. In any case, we came back from Alaska and in the middle in July, and then finished up the summer back in Missoula.
And so that '61 summer was hot,
yes,
meaning it wasn't hot 85, 95 degree necessarily. It was hot because there were a lot of fires,
yes,
right?
Yes.
And then in 1962, it was a cool summer, right?
Yes. And so that the first summer in that July must have been fairly normal. I don't remember anything particular about that, although I spent my 21st birthday on a big fire called Ash Pile Peak, quite appropriately. And at that point, the jumpers had made had hit a number of big fires, and it was decided, as I understand it, that we would not do big fires anymore. We would leave that to the ground pounders, and we would continue focusing on the small fires. And through August of '61, there was quite a lot of fires, so that according to the record, in one 10-day stretch, I jumped 5 times. So I would have jumped in, helped put out the fire, walked out, got back to base, cleaned up a bit, got something to eat, and jumped again.
Walking out. When you say walking out, it sounds kind of simple, but it really wasn't. Can you describe that whole process?
Well, the whole thing is we would have all the equipment. We would have one bag full of the parachute, another bag full of the jumpsuit and the helmet and everything, and plus all our fire equipment that had been dropped in for us. So we would pack it up and carry it out. It seems to me it was 120, 130 pounds. I weighed 160 at the time. And we would carry it out cross country until we hit the first trail. So I don't know, that might be a mile, a couple miles overland. And then when we hit that trail, we would drop the equipment there, keeping only our personal bag, mark it on a map so a mule skinner could come in and pick it up. Then we would hike down the trail till we hit the road, and eventually somebody would pick us up and take us back to base.
1962 was an interesting summer because you graduated from Wesleyan that year, but the call of duty said that you had to be out west in uniform, ready to fight fires, and you had to skip your graduation to be out there on time.
It was because I was on the Alaska crew. If it had been the regular season, there wouldn't have been any problem, but I was on the Alaska crew, which was training early, so I fortunately was able to get my last exam in and head out there. Heretofore, we had always driven back and forth across country, but for the first time I flew out there so I could get there in time, yes.
About how many, well, you probably know this exactly, how many jumps did you make while you were doing this?
Well, we 25 total. 10 of those were practice jumps. The first year you always made 7 jumps. And then every other year you would get 2 practice jumps ahead of the season to get you back in. And then when we went up to Alaska, we had another jump up there out of a very different kind of plane. I don't remember what kind it was, but it was different. So that's 10 practice jumps. So then 15 fire jumps. I had 10 the first season, which was high, and then 5 the second season, 2 up in Alaska, 3 down in the States, and which is sort of normal, below normal.
Is there anything else you'd like to add about those 4 summers?
Oh, it was just a wonderful time being out in the mountains. I was an Eastern college kid, so it was great to get away out there. Haven't had the opportunity to get back into those mountains, unfortunately. But it was just a wonderful time out there. I would have loved to continue it, but I was doing graduate work, which required some summer study, so I had to drop the Forest Service work the next year.
And so 62 was your last Forest work summer as a smoke jumper.
Yes.
And after that summer, you enrolled at Cornell.
I was in graduate school at Cornell, yes.
And you earned a PhD in Southeast Asian and Vietnam history, is that right?
Yes, pre-modern history.
And your career included teaching at Yale, Virginia, UCLA, and the University of Michigan.
Yes.
And you're currently an emeritus professor at the University of Michigan.
I'm a research associate at the Center for Southeast Asian Studies, yes.
I knew you were still active.
Yes.
And so what are you bridging the emeritus and the active role that you've had all these years?
I still work with any students who are around, and I still continue my own research.
Okay. Would it be easy to sum up your stint with the smoke jumpers, or is that a hard thing to do?
No, it was just a wonderful time. One was always nervous about it, going into the jump and everything, but everything worked out okay. I never had any serious problems. Bumped my elbow once on the jump, but that was the extent of it. It was a bunch of regular guys. We couldn't be too big, we couldn't be too small, and it was just a good thing to do.
John, thank you very much for sharing these stories with us. We appreciate you being here today.
Well, thank you.